You know, when we think about those huge, world-changing decisions, what's the image that comes to mind? We tend to picture one person, alone in a room, with the weight of the world on their shoulders. But is that how it really goes down? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this idea of the lone decider versus the committee and see what's myth and what's reality. So I want you to really think about it. What do you see? Is it a president, a prime minister, just methodically weighing every single option? Or is it more like a noisy, chaotic room full of people, all fighting for their point of view? Well, as we're about to find out, the truth is usually a really messy mix of both. And figuring out that mix, well, that's how you start to understand how power actually works. The image we all have in our heads is this perfectly rational leader. Economists even have a name for this concept, Homo economicus. It's this idea of a person who's basically a supercomputer, just calmly processing all the pros and cons and then, boom, picking the absolute best path. It's a really clean, powerful image of leadership. But how often is it actually true? And that brings us right to what's often called the lone decider myth. Now, even though that picture of a solitary leader is so powerful, the honest-to-goodness reality is that it's the exception, not the rule. But, oh man, the exceptions are fascinating because they show just how differently this whole model can play out. I mean, look at these two completely different styles of solitude. On one hand, you've got someone like Ronald Reagan. He famously wanted the most complex problems in the world boiled down to a single sheet of paper with a few options, so he could just tick a box. Simple. And then you have Richard Nixon. He was a classic loner, a guy who would totally isolate himself and make these huge decisions pretty much on his own. It was a kind of solitude that many, many people think led straight to his downfall. Okay, so if the lone decider is so rare, then what's the norm? What's the rule? It's simple, really. The group. The overwhelming majority of big-time decisions are hammered out in meetings, in committees, in task forces. So the real question is, why? Why is that the default? Well, there are some super practical reasons. For one, a group decision just seems more valid, right? It carries more legitimacy. And then there's the big one, political cover. If things go south, the blame is spread around. But it's not all just cynical politics. A good group brings in all these different opinions and expertise that a leader might not have. It eases the incredible psychological weight on one person. And hey, sometimes it's not even a choice, it's just the law. The political scientist Jakob Würzberger really just hits the nail on the head here. He says groups are basically information processing machines. They force you to look at new arguments, to clarify what you're thinking, and to challenge your own assumptions. And in theory, that should lead to a much, much better decision. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's the twist. Just because groups are the norm, and just because they should be better, doesn't mean they always are. Actually, sometimes the group dynamic itself becomes the very thing that drives everything straight into a disaster. You've probably heard this old saying, and it is the perfect way to understand the problem. The committee sets out to design a sleek, fast, beautiful racehorse. But after all the arguments and compromises and bargaining, what they end up with is a camel. It works, I guess, but it's lumpy and slow, and it is definitely not what anybody wanted in the first place. That's what happens when group decision-making goes wrong. Now, the official term for this kind of dysfunction is a group pathology. Think of it like a disease that infects the decision-making process. The group actually starts to shut out new information. It encourages everyone to just conform, to agree, rather than to actually find the best answer. The goal stops being, let's get this right, and starts being, let's just all get along. That's how you get a camel. So how does this even happen? How does a group of smart people get so off track? Well, researchers have zeroed in on a few specific dangers, a few pathologies that can absolutely wreck a group's judgment. We're going to look at 3 of the biggest ones. You should think of these as the giant red flags to watch out for. All right, so here are the 3 biggies we're going to break down. The trap of a bad compromise, the infamous danger of groupthink, and a more subtle but equally dangerous problem called Newgroup syndrome. Let's tackle that first one. First up, compromise and bargaining. This is our camel, through and through. It's what happens when a decision gets watered down to the least common denominator. It becomes the one option that nobody actively hates, but it's also the option that nobody actually loves. The final decision doesn't represent anyone's best idea, just a worn-out, messy bargain. Next, we've got the most famous one of all, groupthink. This term was coined by the psychologist Irving Janis, and it describes what happens when a team becomes so tight-knit, so focused on harmony, that they just stop thinking critically. The need to agree becomes more important than anything else. In a groupthink situation, being a good team player is way more valuable than actually being right. And finally, there's this really fascinating trap called Newgroup syndrome. Just picture it. A president has just been elected, and it's the very first cabinet meeting. Nobody really knows each other, everyone's anxious, they all want to make a good first impression. So what happens? People tend to clam up, they conform really quickly, and they rally around whatever the most assertive leader in the room says, shutting down any real debate before it even starts. So at the end of the day, what's the big takeaway here? It's that we love the myth of the lone genius, but real power and real decisions almost always happen in groups. And those groups, even when they're filled with brilliant, well-meaning people, are incredibly vulnerable to these hidden psychological pressures that can lead to absolute catastrophe. So it leaves us with this one central kind of scary question. How on earth does a room full of smart people come together to make a truly terrible decision? We're going to dive deep into some of the most famous cases of that happening in our next explainer. I'll see you then.
All right, let's get into it. We're going to talk about something that's, well, it's both fascinating and, honestly, a little terrifying. It's this psychological phenomenon that explains how some of the smartest, most experienced people in the world can come together and make some of the absolute worst decisions in history.
So that's the big question, right? How does that even happen? It seems like it shouldn't be possible. To figure it out, we're going to dig into two huge fiascos in American foreign policy, and we're going to look for clues inside the very rooms where these decisions were made.
You know, this question, from President Kennedy himself right after it all went wrong, that's our starting point. It just perfectly captures that feeling of shock when a plan, backed by all the best minds, completely and utterly fails. And that leads us straight to our first case study, the Bay of Pigs fiasco in 1961.
Okay, so you really have to put yourself back in 1961. The Cold War is absolutely raging, and in the US there's this deep, deep fear of the domino theory, this idea that if one country falls to communism, all its neighbors will topple right after. And who's the first domino? Right on America's doorstep, Fidel Castro's Cuba.
So, the brand new Kennedy administration gets this secret CIA plan dropped in their lap, and they decide to go for it. The whole idea was to land this small army of trained Cuban exiles back on the island. They thought it would trigger this massive popular uprising that would just sweep Castro right out of power. Seemed like a pretty clever plan, at least on paper.
Well, the result was a catastrophe. I mean, a total 100% disaster. It's even been called a perfect failure. The uprising? It never happened. Castro's army knew they were coming. The U.S. was left completely embarrassed and even had to pay a huge ransom just to get the captured exiles back. So you have to ask, how did they get it so wrong? A psychologist named Irving Janis dug into this and found 6 huge, flawed assumptions they made. They truly believed their cover story would work, that the Cuban military was a joke, and this is the big one, that the Cuban people would just rise up and join the fight. Every single one of those beliefs was dead wrong.
And get this one little detail shows you just how bad things were. The backup plan, if the invasion failed, was for the fighters to escape into the mountains and start a guerrilla war. The only problem? The landing spot had been changed. Their only escape route now led through hundreds of miles of totally impassable swampland. It's incredible, but it seems like nobody in that room full of geniuses even bothered to look at a map.
Janis argued that this wasn't just a string of mistakes or a bit of bad luck. Nope. He said it was a psychological trap, and he gave it a name, groupthink. It's what happens when a group gets so tight, so focused on everyone agreeing, that they just stop thinking critically. Keeping the harmony of the group becomes way more important than looking at the cold, hard facts.
So let's look at the classic symptoms Janis spotted. First, there's this illusion of invulnerability. Kennedy's team saw themselves as the best and the brightest. They just felt like they couldn't lose. This leads to an illusion of unanimity, because when people start censoring themselves, keeping their doubts quiet to not make waves, it looks like everyone agrees. And then you get what Janis called mind guards. This is wild. This is when members of the group, like Robert Kennedy, actually start protecting the leader from any information that might challenge the plan. It's all about preserving that consensus, even if it's fake.
Now, there is another angle on this. A scholar named Eric Stern suggested maybe it wasn't groupthink, but something he calls Newgroup syndrome. His idea is that the Kennedy team was so new, nobody really knew each other yet.
They were anxious, they were unsure, and so instead of challenging each other, they just went along with the leader and the CIA experts. So you have two different theories for this same disastrous outcome. Either they were too close, or they weren't close enough.
You would think the lessons from the Bay of Pigs would be burned into everyone's memory. But what's really scary is that just a few years later, a very similar group dynamic took hold, and it led to a decision with even more tragic, long-lasting consequences.
In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ, made that fateful decision to send American ground troops into Vietnam, fully Americanizing the war. And this decision wasn't made in some big formal council. No, it was made by a small, tight-knit, informal circle of advisors he called the Tuesday Lunch Group.
And what's so chilling is that Janis saw the exact same symptoms of groupthink all over again. You had that same sense of over-optimism, that feeling of we can't lose, the shutout advice from the outside. People started suppressing their own doubts, and if anyone did speak up and threaten the consensus, they were slowly pushed to the side. It was like the Bay of Pigs was happening all over again, but this time in slow motion and with much, much higher stakes.
And here's where you see how the group actively stamped out any disagreement. When one official, George Ball, raised really good objections, they just gave him a label. Oh, that's just our resident devil's advocate. It was a clever way to not take his concerns seriously. When another aide who was against the bombing walked in, LBJ would mock him, saying, "Well, here comes Mr. Stop the Bombing." And when the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, started having second thoughts, his loyalty was actually questioned.
I mean, listen to this. This is a quote from President Johnson talking about his own Secretary of Defense. It just shows you the incredible personal pressure they put on anyone who stepped out of line. Disagreeing wasn't just having a different opinion, it was painted as a sign of emotional instability.
So after all this, what's the answer to our mystery? How do these catastrophic mistakes happen in rooms filled with brilliant people?
The lesson here isn't about how smart any one person is. It's about collective blindness. In both these cases, you had these rooms packed with intelligent people, but the pressure to be a part of the team, the pressure to agree, just crushed their ability to see the truth. The real danger isn't a lack of intelligence, it's a culture where harmony is more valuable than reality.
And you know, that really leaves us with a pretty powerful question to ask ourselves about our own lives. Think about the groups you're in, at work, in your community, wherever. When everyone around the table is quiet, does that silence actually mean everyone agrees? Or does it mean people are afraid to speak up? That's the question that sits right at the very heart of groupthink.
All right, let's talk about groupthink. You've heard of it, right? It's pretty much the go-to theory we all use to explain huge political screw-ups. But today, we're going to flip the script. We're putting the theory of groupthink itself under the microscope.
You know, we love the idea of groupthink because it seems to answer a really tricky question. How can a room full of brilliant people make a truly boneheaded decision? But what if the explanation itself is part of the problem? What if this theory that we all lean on is actually built on some shaky ground?
So here's the game plan. First, we're going to poke some holes in the groupthink model itself, the theory and the methods behind it. Then we'll go back and look at its most famous case studies, but with fresh eyes and new evidence. And finally, we'll see what a more complete, more nuanced picture actually looks like. Okay, let's dive right in with the theory. Now, when Irving Janis came up with this, it was totally revolutionary. But in the years since, researchers like Philip Tetlock have started to notice some pretty major cracks in its foundation.
When you start kicking the tires on the theory, a few things stand out. For one, it's built on historical case studies, which makes it way too easy to just, cherry-pick the evidence that proves your point. Then there's this suspiciously perfect correlation. Basically, every single time groupthink is supposedly present, the outcome is a disaster. But real life is almost never that clean, right? It also tends to force complex situations into these neat little boxes. Either it's groupthink or it's vigilant decision-making, with no room for gray areas. And maybe the biggest headache of all, it's really hard to tell what's causing groupthink versus what's just a symptom of it. The whole thing gets kind of circular.
And this quote right here, it just nails a huge conceptual problem. Critics pointed out that some of the key symptoms Janis identified, things like a belief in inherent morality or having stereotyped views of the enemy, well, hang on. Are those really about a group trying to agree with each other? Or are they just common biases that people might have anyway, whether they're in a group or not? It's a really good question.
So this leads us to the big one. Okay, the theory's got some issues on paper,
But how does it actually stack up against what happened in history? Let's take a look by revisiting the very cases that made it famous.
All right, now we're getting to the main event. We're going to look at the two debacles that basically made groupthink a household name: the Vietnam War escalation under LBJ and the Bay of Pigs fiasco under JFK.
So the story we all know about Vietnam goes something like this. President Johnson was trapped in an echo chamber, his Tuesday lunch group totally cut off from any and all opposing views. But here's the thing. When a historian named David Barrett actually dug into the declassified archives, he found a completely different story. It wasn't that Johnson didn't hear dissent, it's that he heard it loud and clear.
And this number says it all: 6. That's the number of really important figures. We're talking heavy hitters like his own vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who went directly to Johnson and told him not to escalate the war. So this wasn't a failure to speak up. It was a case of dissent being heard and then being overruled.
And get this is fascinating. The declassified phone calls show a President Johnson who was just agonizing over the war, full of doubt and pessimism. This flies directly in the face of that classic groupthink symptom, the illusion of invulnerability. These guys weren't overconfident, as Barrett called them. They were uncertain warriors.
And it's a really similar story with the Bay of Pigs invasion. The groupthink narrative paints this picture of Kennedy's brilliant, young, new frontier team, just so convinced of their own magic that they couldn't imagine failure. But again, when you look at the evidence, the mood inside the White House seems to have been the total opposite. They weren't feeling omnipotent, they were feeling defensive and totally cornered by the threat of communism.
So if it wasn't groupthink, what the heck was going on? Well, it looks like Kennedy was getting hit from all sides with bad information. The CIA was feeding him misleading intelligence. The former president, Eisenhower, gave him some politically motivated advice that made this terrible plan sound way more plausible than it was. But maybe the biggest culprit of all was a powerful and powerfully wrong historical analogy.
So if groupthink doesn't really hold up as the sole explanation for these disasters, what does?
The answer isn't just another neat little syndrome.
The reality is, well, it's a lot messier, and it has a lot more to do with what's going on inside the minds of individual leaders.
A huge piece of this puzzle is something called analogical reasoning. It sounds kind of academic, but it's something we all do every single day. When you face a new problem, your brain instinctively searches for a similar situation from your past and uses that as a kind of roadmap for what to do next.
And the Bay of Pigs is a textbook example of this in action. See, back in 1954, the CIA had pulled off this seemingly easy coup in Guatemala. They backed a small force, the president got scared, and he fled. So the lesson the Kennedy team learned was, hey, this playbook works. They took that Guatemala analogy and applied it directly to Cuba, assuming Fidel Castro would just fold under pressure like President Arbenz did. They couldn't have been more wrong.
Look, at the end of the day, the key thing to remember is that bad decisions rarely have one single cause. It's so tempting to slap a label like groupthink on a disaster because it's simple, it's clean, but the truth is almost always a complicated mess of individual psychology, flawed analogies, political pressures, and just plain bad intelligence.
And that kind of leaves us with a final, really important question. If a theory as famous and as widely accepted as groupthink can be so full of holes, what does that mean for how we analyze the big decisions our leaders are making right now? It's a challenge to all of us, really. It reminds us to look past the easy labels and to dig a whole lot deeper for the real, complex reasons that shape our world.